What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Health is Hard podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Matt Eichler, and I'm here to help you cut through the noise and find the strategies that actually work for building a stronger, healthier, more resilient you. As a seasoned chiropractor, fitness junkie, and founder of Element X Health and Fitness, I've seen firsthand how confusing and overwhelming the health and fitness landscape can be. That's why I've made it my mission to simplify complex concepts, bust myths, and provide you with actionable tips you can start using today. Each week, we'll dive into topics like optimizing movement, building muscle, bouncing back from injuries, managing pain, managing your mindset, and so much more. Whether you're looking to level up your nutrition game, fine-tune your fitness routine, or just feel better in your own skin, Health is Hard is here for it. I'll do my best to make even the most challenging topics engaging and relatable. I'm hoping you'll be learning, laughing, and leveling up your health every episode. All right, let's dive in. Let the brain gains begin. Remember, the information/opinions provided in these podcasts/videos is/are for entertainment and educational purposes only, and is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Here we are, episode 4. Health is Hard. Tonight, we're going to be deep diving into all things pain, posture, and mobility. This one, I'm going to geek out. I'm going to nerd out and could get a little lengthy. If I go off on some tangents and some rants, just bear with me. Okay. So thanks for coming back to the Health is Hard show. I'm having a great time doing this. It's going to be super fun tonight because this is my wheelhouse. We're talking all about pain, posture, mobility. So we want to just understand some of these concepts so we can maximize the quality of our physical lives. And our physical lives has such a huge role in our overall health, longevity, and just how we show up in the world. And I'm super excited to talk about some things tonight. So we really want to talk about the interconnectedness of pain, posture, and mobility. There's a lot of controversy around posture. There's a lot of controversy around pain right now. And I'm just going to help you navigate through some of the conflicting opinions and then just get a better baseline understanding so that we can better attack some of those aches, pains, injuries, mobility restrictions, and all of that tonight. Okay. So I've learned some things after working with 5,000 plus patients and clients. I've estimated that I've probably worked with that many clients or more now, because I concluded that probably a year or so ago, and probably delivered between 75,000 and 100,000 different unique adjustments and therapies and different movement enhancing modalities. So this is right up my alley, but I am not a pain scientist. I am not a PhD neuroscientist. We're going to be talking about some of those things tonight, but I am not like a guy, like a nerd in a lab that's like totally got everything figured out. And I will cite 17 different peer-reviewed sources with everything that I say tonight. However, hopefully we can connect some dots and we can get to some realizations and we can make some things practical, and you can take away some things from this podcast to where you can improve all those things. So first we're going to tackle pain. All right. We're going to tackle pain and what pain is, how we perceive it, how it ruins our lives sometimes, and just how to go about thinking about it and then therefore addressing it. So the first thing I kind of want to have you understand is pain can actually be a skill. And it's super interesting to understand why that is. But first, we got to understand some of the physiological mechanisms at play here. There's a few different receptors in your body that really help us navigate our physical lives. So there's really no pain receptors. Pain comes from nociception, which we'll dive into in a minute. But there's a few other receptors that I want to talk about first. So first of all, let's talk about mechanoreceptors. So mechanoreceptors are these little receptors within our neurology, a lot of times in like our skin and our muscles and our joints, that pick up our physical interaction with the world. And mechanoreceptors sometimes there's a bunch of different kinds of them, but mechanoreceptors sense things like pressure and touch and like just, what we're up against in our lives, like what are we doing physically. And then there's another whole receptor bundle that are called proprioceptors. Now, proprioceptors, and we're going to dive into proprioception later. I'm going to try not to make this too heady and nerdy and sciencey, but proprioception is super interesting. And I've done a lot of research on proprioception, and I think proprioception is actually the gateway to really enhancing movement and really enhancing just our ability to stay coordinated with our movement and move better, and also move enough to where it satisfies a lot of our physical needs, and we just get better with dealing with the daily physical stressors that get thrown at us. So let's dive into nociception. Nociception is basically your body's ability to perceive a threatening stimulus. So when you encounter, let's say, something that like cuts you, or something that, let's say you roll your ankle and all of a sudden now you've twisted some ligaments, and now you've got these nociceptors that are sensing the physical threat. And the physical threat sometimes runs up to your brain and all of a sudden now causes pain. But pain is super interesting because it's not always perceived similarly between person to person. There's a lot of different factors where pain can be influenced by those factors. So nociception is super interesting because it's not pain, but it's a threatening stimulus that is picked up by the nociception. The nociception runs up to your brain, and now your brain decides what kind of response it's going to deliver or it's going to send back. And that can be influenced by a lot of different factors. So, but the interesting thing is that nociception can reduce, like continued nociception can reduce both mechanoreception and proprioception. And I know that those are just big words right now, but we're going to dive a little bit more into it. But just to understand that there's no pain receptors, there's just nociceptors, and those nociceptors are actually kind of differently interpreted by different brains. So super interesting. But that kind of makes up the bulk of your sensory system. There's a lot of different sensory receptors and sensory mechanisms in your body and in your neurology. But those are the things that are the bulk of what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay. So let's dive in here. Pain specifically can change you. And like I said, is it a skill? Sometimes pain is almost improved. Sometimes pain can be like a skill. Like if we experience pain a lot, we adapt as far as how we respond to pain. And sometimes we respond in not so good ways, and then sometimes we respond in better ways. Basically, if we get better at the skill of sensing pain, well, sometimes that can lead to a hypersensitivity and an ongoing tendency to pick up pain maybe in a quicker fashion. Maybe we notice those threats. Maybe those nociceptors get so sensitive that now when we sense a threat, sometimes it's not even a physical insult to the tissue, but we may experience pain, especially in the situations where we are in chronic pain. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the chronic pain tonight, which is really just my wheelhouse. Not a scientist, but it's my wheelhouse as far as what I see in my daily practice and my daily life. So, but when it comes to how pain gets kind of lodged in your nervous system, it's because of this continual nociception. We continuously threaten those tissues in the same similar fashion. Well, now your body gets more sensitive to that stimulus. So it's almost like we become hypersensitive. It's like a skill that, like riding a bike. Now we're like, oh, we know that pain. So now we're going to alarm everything. We're going to set off the alarm bells to create the response. And sometimes that's like a hypersensitivity to pain. And that's where things get a little weird, because now we get super worried about, doing certain things. Oh, I can't do that because I know I'm going to have pain. Or even when you're doing something where you've had pain in the past, oh, now you're starting to feel it, even though maybe there's no tissue insult, there's no actual injury. It's a crazy complex system. So tonight, like I said, this might get a little heady and it might be hard to follow, but just hang with me because I think there's going to be some real solid nuggets in here that improve just the quality of your life. So what can we do about pain? When somebody has an injury or an issue, or they're having a lot of nociception and it's being perceived as pain, what do people do? Most people run off to the doctor, they run off to the chiropractor, they run off to the, your GP or something, that you get some pain meds, you dull that response as best you can, you deal with the inflammation. People everybody perceives and deals with pain differently. But there's really one major theme that is going to efficiently address pain. And that is, we have to lower the threatening inputs. Okay. So obviously, when there's some sort of threat to our physical body, whether that's an injury, whether that's an actual tissue insult, whether that's a perception of a tissue insult, or that's an actual tissue degradation or damage, that's when we tend to sense pain. Now, how do we reduce those threatening inputs? Those threatening inputs can be a multitude of factors, right? And one of the main ways is that we need to reduce the physical stressors that are causing those nociceptive reactions. Okay, so it's funny how stress comes back around. There's a reason why I did those first couple of podcasts really hammering stress, because it's going to come up over and over again. And with all the things that I've studied, all the things that I've learned, it's really going to become this repetitive theme where stress, whether it's physical, chemical, or emotional, is going to be involved. And when we can learn to buffer and deal with and better regulate those stress mechanisms and build resilience to the stress, well, we're going to be in a much better situation. And it just continues to come back up with every single situation that I assess, or every I guess the therapeutic approach that I take. It's like, we got to minimize the threat, we got to minimize the stress, and then build resilience to be able to deal with it better next time, or actively in the moment. So the first thing we got to do is figure out how we can lower the threatening input. Now, the threatening input, like I said, can be physical stress. Now, sometimes injuries happen, things occur, traumas happen, that kind of thing. And there's not much you can do about that in the moment. But you got to think about all the other physical stressors you may be under, and then how to best navigate those or minimize those or deal with those. But stress itself can be a factor as far as, we talked about a cup analogy not so long ago. If your cup's about to overflow because you got too many stressors, well, now maybe you even will perceive pain quicker, you're more hypersensitive to certain situations, maybe past experiences that have caused you pain. So it can be a mess. And the best way to minimize those threatening inputs is a couple different ways. Now, this is super interesting, because I live in one world, but also I'm trying to merge the two worlds. And there's two primary systems for decreasing that threat response, or decreasing that threatening input. And the first one would be called the bottom up approach. Now, the bottom up approach would be more of like dealing with the hardware. Okay. So when we think about like a computer analogy, we got the hardware and then we got the software. So we got the hardware that is the physical makeup of the computer and what it's doing, and all the functions of it. But then we have the software that runs on the computer, right? So we have the software that is basically the program that is kind of programmed into the hardware. And the software is what runs the hardware. So it's super interesting how this also works within our bodies as well. So the bottom up approach to addressing pain would be attacking the hardware. And we do that a number of different ways. We could be doing it with adjustments, finding some sort of physical problem and manipulation, or we could even do it with like inflammation reduction. That would be also working on the hardware in a number of different ways there. A number of different ways you could do that. We could do some sort of myofascial work, where we're working on the muscular tissue and helping create better movement, even corrective exercises, and actively creating exercise modalities and corrections to help deal with some sort of weakness or restriction or instability. So that would be the hardware approach, but we also have a software approach too. And this has become way more popular in the last 5 to 10 years as well. And this deals with a little bit more of how you're cognitively perceiving and thinking about pain, and understanding pain a little bit better, and understanding that not always is there pain because there's an injury or because there's a tissue insult, that sometimes this pain can get stuck or get lodged in your neurology. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So let's tackle the hardware approach a little bit more here. So basically, when you take part in a lot of these like passive therapies, like I'm thinking like adjustments, I'm thinking like inflammation reducing technologies and whatnot, like electrical muscle stims and ultrasounds, and a lot of passive things being done to you, but even active therapies as well, like where you're actually engaging in some sort of exercise, or you're engaging in some sort of corrective maneuver where you're actually trying to address some physical inefficiencies or deficiencies. That's a hardware approach, and we're really tackling the anatomy that's involved with the pain. But that anatomy is inevitably going to heal. We are healing. We are healing adaptation beings. We are healing adaptation organisms, and we usually come back to a homeostasis eventually, where things heal, things come back to pretty much full function if if attacked, if addressed correctly, I guess. So this bottoms up approach is great. It can be super helpful, especially in the acute phase, but also even in the chronic phase, but it has some limitations. Okay. So let's say, we're dealing with just the hardware, and we're getting somewhere with pain reduction. We're improving things, but the very nature of the approach a lot of times is reinstilling that there's a physical problem, that there's some sort of tissue insult, there's some sort of dysfunction, there's some sort of fault there's some sort of defective nature to you or your tissue or your issue. Tissue issue, kind of funny. So the hardware approach can be great, but not forever. Because if we rely on a constant corrective mechanism, or we put too much weight in the fact that, I have to do these corrective exercises to fix my muscle imbalances or whatever, then it reinforces this defective nature of ourselves. And that can be really harmful over time. So I'm just going to read this right here. The problem with this hardware only approach is that the treatment is justified in a context that reinforces the belief system that there is something wrong with the tissues or joints or whatever it is. And then that can raise the threat level. And then that potentially is only providing like short-term relief, and it just continues to be this vicious cycle. Okay. So if the hardware is treated, but the software is not addressed, well, then we could still have some bugs in the software, right? So let's talk a little bit more about that process. Let's talk a little bit more about the software. So the software is a little bit more of the cognitive aspect of pain, and it's a little bit more non-nociceptive. So this goes beyond what we're sensing. And this can be things like pain education, understanding what pain is, which is what I'm trying to do right now. Cognitive behavioral therapy, whatever we can do to decrease fear around certain aspects of the pain, whether it's a certain movement or a certain thing or a certain task that injured us in the beginning, and now we're afraid to do it. That's something called fear avoidance that we're really going to tackle and talk about here. So basically, by addressing the software and thinking about pain differently can be really effective, and maybe 50% of the battle of actually recovering from somewhat of a chronic issue, or maybe even an acute issue. Read this here real quick. If we explain pain always as a structural damage / defective hardware situation, every time people feel pain, they perceive that they have re-injured or never fully healed, or something they're doing is causing tissue damage, making them worse. Now, this is one of my biggest pet peeves. If I had a nickel for every time somebody said, "Oh, I just quit doing everything because I was afraid I was going to make something worse," eye roll. Okay. It's so common for people to just give up everything because they're like terrified that they're going to make their issue worse, even when it's like something completely irrelevant. Like, let's say somebody has a shoulder tweak and they all of a sudden are like, "Nope, can't go to the gym." I'm like, there's so many things you can do that doesn't involve your shoulder. Like, even if you want to completely pause on everything shoulder related, go hit your legs, go do some cardio. Like, you shouldn't stop moving. Okay. And we're going to reiterate that over and over and over again tonight. However, I'm going to read something here real quick. So, what happens when people stop doing everything and they say, "Oh, I'm scared I'm going to make it worse," is I forgot to tell you, a lot of what we're talking about here tonight is highlighted in better detail. And I'm without my rambles and without my tangents on my website, drmatteichelor.com. There's an article there. I think it's called Pain, Posture, Performance, Proprioception, all something along those lines. It's like 4 P words, and just how it's going to affect your daily life and whatnot. So, drmatteichelor.com, great article. I wrote it a while ago. I think it was like mid 2023. So it was a while ago, maybe almost a year ago. And it highlights a lot of this. So we're basically revisiting a lot of those ideas tonight, and I've expanded upon them a little bit, and now we're talking about it. But this is a little excerpt from the article. So basically, it's talking about when somebody says, "I stopped everything because I was scared to make it worse," and then I'm going to jump right into a little bit of a quote. So they start scouring their daily life for pain triggers, and they go to the extreme lengths to rid their routines of any pain-causing behaviors. Might not be a bad thing, however. They buy new pillows, posture braces, lumbar supports, beds, chairs, stand-up desks. They cuss their bosses out. They quit their jobs. They drop booklets of FMLA paperwork on my desk. I hate that stuff. But this thinking, this approach heightens the threat level in their brain, which is actually leading to the pain persistence. So when we attack things from that approach, sure, we want to minimize the pain triggers. However, when we eliminate everything and we let the pain completely change our lives, now we've got a whole different problem. So we might be doing what's best for us in the short term, but we're really jacking ourselves up long term. Okay. So it really leads to this fear avoidance behavior. And this fear avoidance is really one of my missions to minimize and to reduce within the general population. This is one of the main problems that is leading to so many people having chronic pain for years. I'm talking maybe never goes away. So let's dive into the fear avoidance model a little bit more here. And it says there's a lot of studies on this now, and the fear avoidance model is now seen as a central mechanism of how acute pain turns into chronic pain. And chronic pain is a mother, you know what I mean? It's one of those things where now we've created so many neurological triggers that it's hard to not feel pain. It almost becomes part of people's identity. People wear it as a badge of honor. And I think that's so crazy. I'm like, why are you proud that you endure pain every day? What is so cool? What is so noble about that? Blows my mind. You know, some people are like, "Oh yeah, I've had this crazy knee pain for years because back in the military, I jumped out of a Humvee and landed weird. I just kept trucking, whatever. Now for 30 years, I know I'm going to have a knee replaced. Probably have to have the other one replaced. I'm probably going to lead to a hip in my back. You know, it's crazy. People are wild about what they value as far as their identity, you know, and how they deal with pain. And really it's funny because some people, like, they endure the pain every day, but they don't realize how it's completely changed their life, radically decreased their quality of life, and actually made them go down a trajectory that has led them to a very miserable existence. And no shade on the military guys. Those are my favorite guys to treat. I love them. They're fantastic. I wish I could just treat veterans for free forever, because I have so much respect for what they've done. And but anyways, that was just a random example. It could be could be a trucker, you know, that has dealt with multiple discs blowing out left and right, and now is just has horrific back pain, but is almost like proud of it because of what I'm a great American trucker. I've been doing this for 50 years. Da, da, da. And you know, I've it's just, I have so many stories that are just lodged in here that just, I'm just like, okay, cool. I respect what you've done. I respect what your profession was. And I love the fact that you're a persistent, hardworking, blue collar dude. That's awesome. But living in chronic, horrific pain to a point where you can barely do anything, physical at 60 some years old, just isn't impressive to me. Like, there's so many ways to get around that. You don't have to just live in this horrific, painful situation where you're popping 4 Advil to get the day started. And then, you're dealing with your pain later by drinking and this and that. Like there's other approaches. Now, not always your fault, because a lot of the standard medical model doesn't address this correctly. They just say, hey, pop these pills, painkillers, muscle relaxers, you'll be all right, whatever, just deal with the symptoms. No, we got to trace this back and figure out. No, we got to trace this back and figure out why you have the pain. Now, when you have the pain because of an actual tissue injury, that's one thing. But did that injury heal? Did you have that hip replaced? Did you have that knee replaced? Do you still have chronic inflammation? Or is this just lodged in your system to a point where now you can't escape it? And you don't know how to escape it because nobody's told you how to escape it. Nobody's told you how to deal with it. Nobody's told you how to address it and overcome it and build resilience. So now you don't have it. So let's dive back in. I told you there's going to be some tangents tonight. Okay, so the fear avoidance model. We're going to jump back in. Fear avoidance is a really important thing to understand because when we fear what caused us pain or doing something that causes us pain, I understand that. I get it. You don't want to do those things because they hurt, clearly. However, do you think that's a good approach to just avoid those things for the rest of your life? Or should you figure out a strategy to overcome that hurdle, to get back into doing those things somehow? Don't know how yet. I'm going to help you with that. However, just having the mental fortitude to want to address it and not just feel like a victim and just deal with it and just feel like, oh, this is my life now. That's the first step. Okay. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go too. But pain education, this is something that needs to be emphasized more with practitioners. I understand we're all busy. We don't have time to sit and have an hour-long conversation. That's why I'm doing these podcasts. But understanding pain and understanding how it doesn't always mean there's an injury, doesn't always mean that you're making something worse is the first huge hurdle to understanding that you can overcome a chronic pain issue. Okay. So, it basically comes down to the fact that, pain does not always equal there is harm being done. Okay. And once you understand that, then we can really start to expand and start to get through it. So, let's dive into this a little bit more though. So between those two approaches, the hardware version and the software version, I can't describe to you enough how annoyed I get when I see all these different practitioners, especially on social media, bickering about what's better. We need to address it all. Why are we not trying to tackle it all? Why aren't we not trying to improve as physicians and clinicians and figure out how can we incorporate it all? Like, you've got people on the internet now, you've got physical therapists and chiropractors fighting all the time. You've got pain scientists, PhDs that have never treated a person in their life, telling everybody that they're silly for even doing these passive therapies because they don't work. You just got to address their mind. You got to, and then you've got MDs and different, people that will say, different doctors that will say, it doesn't matter. They just need this or they just need that. There's so much gray. Everybody wants everything black and white. But pain and posture and movement and all that, there's so much gray. Okay. Now, navigating the gray is what I'm going to help you do with this podcast, but with ongoing podcasts. But it's just my pet peeve to see everybody fighting over such silly little nuances. It's so funny nowadays with social media, how you have these evidence-based, or let's say science obsessed clinicians that will try to hammer somebody for doing something that they've gotten results with. I think about, like, there's a lot of people just dogging on manual therapy, and manual therapy can be anything from adjustments to massage to myofascial release to cupping and scraping and all that stuff. And there's a lot of people that are like, oh, it doesn't work. It's not doing what you think it's doing. The patient doesn't understand that. So the placebo effect's involved and all that. It's just crazy. However, there's a place for it all. Okay. And really, who cares what's working? Who cares what's improving that patient as long as that patient is improving, right? So sure, we should be mindful of what the research says and what the research is explaining as far as what's most effective. Of course. And I am the first person to tackle new research studies and whatnot, and understand, how can we best incorporate that into our models and our protocols. But when you've gotten results with something for years, like let's just say chiropractors, let's take chiropractic adjustments. There's so many people online that will say chiropractors are complete quacks, that chiropractic adjustments do nothing. Now, I understand where it's coming from. I do, because it's not an end all be all. It's a passive therapy. It's improving somebody's movement in a one-off scenario, and the fact that needs so many different variables to potentially stick and actually be an effective thing long term. I get that. However, you can't deny how many lives chiropractors have changed. I mean, our clinic specifically has, I think, 300 5-star reviews. When somebody that's why when some of these things come at me and they're like, "Hey, my uncle doesn't believe in chiropractors because his MD said that," I'm like, okay, I don't care. The 300 5-star Google reviews we have says otherwise. And I could probably Google chiropractic in my area and find 4 or 5 other clinics that have nearly that many reviews saying all the same things. Oh my gosh, this changed my life. Who cares about the mechanisms? Okay. Now, of course, we're not trying to create dependencies. We're not trying to create this constant, hey, you need me or else you're going to be in pain or you're doomed. It's a whole nother discussion. But let's just think about hardware, software. What do we need to address? What's better? Neither. Probably 50-50. We need to address both. And sometimes they're not mutually exclusive. Like as we're addressing one, it's working on the other one. So if I'm adjusting a patient, I'm making them feel better. I'm making them move better. I'm encouraging them to go move. I'm encouraging them to test the boundaries. I'm encouraging them to, get stronger, build resilience. But sure, utilize my services, utilize some massage, utilize some myofascial techniques. Those help you move better. They help you feel better so you can go and do better. So are we not encouraging the mindset, the software reprogramming in the same breadth of what we're trying to, in the same mechanism, in the same effort? I think we are. So it's just interesting how there's a lot of confusion out there. There's a lot of infighting between practitioners and whatnot. And it's just ridiculous. I think that there's so much missing the forest for the trees that we just need to like step back and look at some bigger picture stuff every now and then. But basically we need to, but basically the biggest determining factor for me with what works better here for pain is an active patient process. So what I would say, I kind of call it that, but I think the patient has to be actively involved. If they're just passive in the process, it reinforces that they need those processes. It reinforces that they need those therapies, that the patient has to be actively involved. So the answer to fear avoidance in the world of physical therapy and chiropractic is what we would call graded exposure. Now, this has a few different meanings in my head, but graded exposure is usually looked at as whatever the threatening situation was, is that we need to, in a graded fashion, get you back to being able to do that without having the same reaction or without having the same injury. So that would be graded, slow progressing exposure to the almost exact same thing that hurt you to begin with. Beautiful. Love it. I think that's important. But graded exposure can also be almost interpreted from an exercise or just physicality, from an exercise or just a physicality perspective as well. So you could also, instead of completely stopping all exercise and just saying, oh, I don't want to make something worse, I don't know, you could also graded expose yourself to, you could also progressively expose yourself to just exercise, nutrition, anything that's going to positively impact your health, but specifically something in the category of what you think harmed you to slowly build your capacity back for said thing, but also the overall health benefits that come with that are undeniable as well. So, graded exposure is super important. And it's really become my mission with my online health and coaching is basically eliminating fear avoidance and focusing on graded exposure, whether it comes to and focusing on graded exposure, whether it's a specific acute injury or it's a specific health modality that you're afraid to do, whether it become that you're afraid to do, like going to the gym or taking on a new physical practice of some sort. We need to expose ourselves to those things because sometimes that physicality aspect is the most important or most effective thing we can do for our health. For our health, the most effective thing we can do for our health. So, but when you think about it, if you sit back and you let something win, I know I just recently almost got in a little bit of a tiff or a fight with my girlfriend because um, she was not feeling good, and I understand she was coming down with something. She was a little sick, and I said something like, "Well, yeah, you need to rest, but just laying in bed all day and not somewhat going about your business to the best of your ability is letting this thing win." I have always felt as if when you can carry on to the best of your ability, not to a point where you're aggravating or re-irritating or you're worsening, because that becomes obvious over time or almost sometimes in the moment, well, then you're going to be well on your way to overcoming said obstacle. So let's say you got a cold, right? Oh, I got a cold. I got maybe it's like flu-like symptoms. I feel terrible. I'm just going to lay in bed all day. I'm just going to call in sick. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to rest. I need rest. I need rest. I need rest. Sure, you need rest, but you also have to understand what are the physiological mechanisms within your body that's going to help you overcome that. Movement, probably draining your lymphatic system, opening things up, loosening your body up, loosening up the ability for your body to exchange tissues, getting some good fresh air, getting out in the sun, get some vitamin D, move around, go for some walks as best you. I understand you're probably tired. You're probably fatigued. Your body's kind of telling you it needs to rest, and it's very important to listen to that. However, you don't let it dominate your life. When you let it dominate your life, well, then you get it lodged in there that you can't do anything when you're feeling a certain type of way. And that's so important when it comes to pain as well. So let's say you tweak your back. Now you want to avoid anything that involves your back. Well, that's a mistake because the only way you're going to overcome the back pain is by building the resilience to said stimulus that irritated your back to begin with. Okay. It's the only way, because if you avoid it for the rest of your life, well, then it's always here. It's always stuck in your head that that's going to be a problem, which always keeps the problem readily available, which you can just call up on the software, like opening a window on your computer at any moment. All right. Instead of almost uninstalling the software, right? We got to go in there and figure out, okay, there's all these different mechanisms as to why that issue happened. Now let's uninstall, and let's build a better program to where now that doesn't as easily become chaotic and haywire. All right. I know this is getting a little crazy, but it's important to understand. Okay. So graded exposure, that's become my mission. That's become the Element X Health and Fitness mission. Graded exposure. So let's move on. One of the main things that we're learning about graded exposure is that is it actually helping because it's physically rebuilding the capacity, or is it just lowering the threat level of said thing in your brain? And the answer is it's probably both. So when I'm dealing with a patient that has acute low back pain, and I'm just encouraging them to still go to the gym and do what you can, work around the issue. Don't do anything that's more than a 3 out of 10 level pain. If you are experiencing a 3 out of 10 level pain, there's a good chance that you may be irritating, you may be creating more of a problem. But if it's under a 3 out of 10, there's a good chance that you're not. So why not still do it? Matter of fact, that's the only way you're going to overcome this obstacle, is by, physically building the resilience to still to have the capacity to not end up in the situation again. Okay. So in that process, you're actually reprogramming the software as you're rebuilding the hardware, which is brilliant. And we need to look at it more that way. So movement is medicine, and it's medicine with a bunch of side benefits minus the side effects. So it's kind of a no-brainer. So what's happening when I encourage my patients to still work out and still get moving and still try to work around their issues? Is it the hardware or is it the software? Well, it's actually doing all of it at the same time. So the hardware is doing the necessary stuff to heal, usually when you're trying to stay moving and you're tackling things from a physical perspective, you're doing some physical therapy and that kind of a thing. But also, as you make those little mini realizations that you're capable of certain things without the pain, well, now that's reprogramming the software. So you're reprogramming the software as you rebuild the hardware. And that's where it's at. Always think about that from that perspective. But let's tackle a little bit of a real world example here. I'm just going to read this. This is from the article, but you're going to meet Chris. So Chris is a pretty fit 36-year-old personal trainer. Chris hurts his lower back doing some deadlifts. He's down and out for a few days, but within a week or so, he's at least functional. He still has varying levels of pain dependent upon certain movements and physical tasks, but he's nowhere near as bad as he was for those first couple days. Eventually, his severe pain transforms into just a nagging ache that can vary from mild to moderate intensity depending on the day or the task or whatever. But now, every time he tries to set up for a deadlift, he feels significant pain in his lower back. And on his bad days, sometimes just bending down to pick up his kid's toys nearly drops him to his knees. He works in the fitness field and strongly believes that the key to getting stronger and bigger and doing all the things that he wants to do is performing those big exercises like squats and deadlifts. So Chris runs off to his local chiropractor for a couple cracks that feel good, but relief is short-lived. He gets an MRI because he's frustrated, and that shows multiple disc herniations in his lower back. He gets a few injections from an orthopedic doctor. He then begins physical therapy as instructed by his orthopedic doctor. And the physical therapist tells him that his hips are uneven, his hamstrings are too tight, and his glutes aren't firing. All this has convinced him that he has significant structural damage and faulty hardware. His pain has now dulled, but over the course of a month or so, it's dropped from a 9 to about a consistent 4 or 5. However, his beliefs, his attitude, and his emotions have heightened the threat level in the brain, and that's made his nervous system a lot more sensitive to pain. He tries doing some deadlifts, but gets pain when he exceeds a certain weight. So he just gives up on deadlifting altogether. And he says, that's for the young guys anyways. Fast forward 3 or 4 years, and now Chris still feels pain every morning, especially when he's bending over the sink to brush his teeth, or when he's riding a bike or an elliptical or doing anything related to his hips or low back for an extended period of time. Now he strongly believes his low back is very vulnerable to injury, and he will never be able to deadlift or squat heavy again. But because he's a gym rat, and still has an attachment to the way it made him feel when he could deadlift 300 or 400 pounds, he's researching like crazy to see if it really is something that's just in his past. So now things are looking up. His 4th chiropractor has finally explained to him that deadlifts aren't inherently dangerous, how complicated pain can be, how pain is an experience constructed in the brain, and how he may be dealing with software issues more so than hardware issues, considering it's been so long since his initial injury. So the software down approach. He now clearly understands that the broken anatomy model, which relies solely on the bottom-up approach, is incomplete. Just by understanding the physiology of pain and the top-down approach, his threat level has lowered in the brain. He's given himself permission to get into certain positions and exercises now, not thinking he's aggravating his broken anatomy or faulty hardware. His nervous system is much less sensitive to pain, and the brain finds no reason to induce pain because there is no threat and no action required. He feels much less pain now. But also, the hardware up approach is still happening, and the graded exposure method. So he keeps seeing his chiropractor and diligently doing his corrective exercises, but now gradually starts incorporating deadlift variations and squats with light weights and stays in a range that keeps him from flaring up. Within a few months, he is squatting and deadlifting at nearly his full capacity. He's almost hit the same weights that he could do before, and he has very little pain. Now he's ditched his chiropractor and only does a few of the corrective exercises. All right. So great example, right? So I see Chris's all the time. And a good chiropractor, a good physical therapist is going to address all the things and then utilize graded exposure without being reckless to get Chris back to doing the things he wants to do, or else that gets lodged in his brain. And now it's something that he almost never overcomes. So good on that guy. Not actually, that's a made up example. I completely made that up because I see many people in that same exact situation and have pretty much been there myself. All right. So now that we understand pain better, we're going to get off that crazy neurology, heady stuff, and we're going to talk about posture. All right. So posture is super interesting right now because there's so much controversy about posture. You've got all the evidence-based bros saying, oh, it doesn't matter. And then you've got people that are like, if you don't have the right neck curve, you're going to die. Like, we got to meet in the middle here and understand, let's use some common sense here and understand where posture has utility, what it actually is. Are we doing a disservice by ignoring it? Are we doing a disservice by obsessing over it? It's like, hey, there's extremes of everything, and we need to just chill. We need to just chill and come to the middle and try to utilize the utility of whatever it is on the extremes, bring it in, and let's create some sort of a model where we don't have to get triggered by talking about certain things. We don't have to be so sensitive about how we explain things. At the end of the day, we're just being effective. If that was more emphasized, I think that we'd be in such a better place when it comes to like orthopedic health in this country. I mean, we are in a freaking disaster right now. I mean, low back pain and aches and pains, chronic pain is just absolutely bonkers. The more peer reviewed papers and the more science we have and all these things, we understand more, but we're worse. Explain that to me. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So all the super arrogant evidence-based guys that are trashing everybody online, well, let's take a step back. Let's like actually think about this. Are we in a better place because of all the evidence? Are we in a better place because we dog on some practitioner for doing some certain thing? Or we hate on some trainer for doing a certain thing? Or we make fun of somebody online for the way that they're doing a certain exercise? No, you've actually just created a barrier to entry for a lot of normal people now that don't want to end up on TikTok because they didn't know what they were doing in the gym, but they were still there willing to try. Okay. So that is like my biggest pet peeve, is that all this controversy and like kind of like cyberbullying, whether it's somewhat justified in somebody's head, it blows my mind. Like, let's just be nice. Let's just be positive. Let's just try to make improvements in this world. Let's not just figure out a way to trash everybody to try to like self-aggrandize and like try to promote ourselves because we're holier than thou because of our evidence-based brain. Like, this shit's crazy to me. Blows my mind. But anyways, back to posture. I guess I went on that rant because there's so many people that will say, if you even say the word posture, people get all uncomfortable. They get all like triggered. They're all like, posture doesn't matter. Or, I read something about the evidence says that the posture doesn't. Dude, come on. Let's understand what posture actually is. All right. Posture. It doesn't exist. That's it. That's all. Let me explain to you why I feel that way. Now, don't get me wrong. I think there's a couple, 2 or 3 major postures or shapes. It's almost funny to see how certain practitioners have to talk about posture. They almost have to change the language because the word posture just triggers so many people in the world of evidence-based manual therapy and movement specialties. It's hilarious. So even like people like Kelly Starrett, who's a gangster who's been in the game forever, and I would respect his opinion over almost all these new evidence-based bros, has to say he calls it your shape. And really, every time he says shape, I just think posture. He just changed his language because he understands how it messes with people. Shout out to Kelly Starrett. He's taught me so much through some seminars and his books and stuff. Brilliant guy, and he's funny as hell too. I love him. But anyways, back to posture. So I should say that static posture doesn't exist, because it doesn't really. Your static posture is a brief snapshot in time, and your posture is really just a window to how your physical body has come to this moment and also how it moves. So if we understand that we're never not moving, we're always, our heart is always pumping, our rib cage is always expanding because of our breath, blood is always pumping through our veins. Our bodies are never not moving, even when we're sleeping, even when we're passed out, our bodies are moving. So you never are in a static posture. Now, you might be able to take an x-ray of a static posture. You might be able to take a picture of a static posture, but in reality, it has minimal utility because it's changing in that moment, right? You were able to take that x-ray in a nanosecond, but the posture changed as soon as you told that patient to change positions, right? And there's a huge difference between taking a picture of somebody and then telling somebody to actually stand up in a decent tall posture as best they can, whatever is comfortable for them. You'll see major changes on x-ray. I do this all the time now. So when I take an x-ray of somebody, I say, okay, I want you to stand in your normal posture, whatever feels comfortable for you, but stand up tall, how you normally would, but to a point where it's comfortable for you and you don't feel like you're overexerting yourself to stand in a certain position. It's easy, right? You'd be shocked at sometimes when you tell somebody that before you x-ray them and then you don't tell them that, how much different their x-ray could look. Now, I am a big fan of x-ray technology and whatnot because I've caught so many things over the years that I would have had no idea were there if I didn't take an x-ray. And that's a whole nother discussion we're going to talk about a little bit more. But basically, your posture doesn't exist because there is no static posture. It's always just a succession of different movements. And sometimes your best posture is your next posture, right? As long as we're moving, your posture doesn't matter as much. However, there are some things that can contribute to certain shapes and patterns that I find can be super detrimental because that shape or that pattern being the starting point by which you move puts you at a disadvantage right away. I kind of explain it to a lot of patients as like your posture is like your orthopedic vulnerability. Your standard posture, whatever your body's defaulting to, if it's suboptimal when you consider joint centration and mechanics and mechanical leverage and understanding how to move, and if you move from this position versus this position to begin with, well, you're going to have a whole lot more advantage in this one versus that one. Then we understand posture is important. So to recap, posture is just a phase of movement. Static posture doesn't really exist, so I don't really care about it as much. Now, I use it as a tool. I use it as a window to understand somebody's orthopedic and physical life, but I don't care too much if you look a certain way most of the time, unless I know it's directly contributing to your motor dysfunction. And that motor dysfunction is directly contributing to your pain, symptom, whatever you're seeking my help for. I'm probably gumming this all up and making it even more complicated, but let's talk about what makes up posture. So I'm sorry, I just said a posture doesn't exist, but I'm going to explain that by explaining why posture doesn't exist via what posture actually is. And maybe we're just repeating ourselves a little bit here, but just hang with me because I think this is going to make sense. So if you take posture, how somebody holds themselves, and you scale it down, what makes up that image or that position or that shape that they are holding themselves in? Well, it's their anatomy, right? It's their specific anatomy. It's if you scale it down, it's all the joints and tendons and muscles and ligaments and stuff that have adapted to a certain position that makes that shape comfortable for them in that moment. Maybe it's not comfortable for them. Maybe that's why they're in your office, is because they're uncomfortable because their body's adapted to a certain position. But I'm just going to call that segments. Okay, so we have segments, which is your anatomy and how it's holding itself. And then we have the posture. Now, posture I would consider almost synonymous with something called joint centration. And joint centration is basically the optimal position of that joint for its maximal usage, whether that's mobility, stability, power, strength, all those things. Okay. So the segments, the anatomy makes up the posture. The posture is dictated by the anatomy. And then if you scale it up, well, that shape is how you move. So when you're in that posture, that shape, or that position, well, that is your starting point for how you move. And if you are not in a very good position, there's pretty common issues. Now, sometimes there's exceptions to this rule. This is where we miss the forest for the trees sometimes, is because we obsess over the exceptions. And a lot of times when somebody rolls their shoulders in and they have this kind of like hunchy forward shoulder position, locked up T-spine, head sitting super forward, and then they go to do overhead work from that position, most of the time their shoulder is going to start to hurt eventually. They're going to have pinchy issues unless they have like super anatomy that's super resilient and doesn't get affected by that stimulus. Over time, most of the time, they're going to develop some sort of shoulder impingement or pain, or maybe it's going to work its way up into their traps and neck, and they're going to have headaches and constant neck pain. It's almost predictable, okay? But it's because moving from a disadvantageous position repetitively eventually catches up to you. and that is what posture has an influence over, is movement. So now it's not to say that somebody that has bad static posture, which doesn't exist, but in the moment when you see somebody, you're like, oh, that person doesn't look like they have very good posture. If when they go to move, they default into a better position before they move, maybe that posture doesn't matter. Okay. But the realistic probability of that happening, I think, is usually pretty low. Unless there's some superstar athlete that understands how to move really good, but they just have kind of crummy posture to begin with. That's rare. So it matters. Scaled down, it's just the anatomy and the segments that make up that specific posture and shape at that moment that can change over time. You're not locked into a certain posture for the rest of your life because you've gotten there. But then scaled up, it's just how you move. It's the starting point for how you move. And how you move is how you get injured most of the time, excluding, random traumas and that kind of thing. I talked about a few different receptors in the beginning. We had proprioceptors, we had mechanoreceptors, and we had nociceptors. Now, proprioceptors are mechanoreceptors. They're kind of mechanoreceptor. We're not going to get into all the nuances of that. But proprioception is a super interesting thing. And I want to just talk a little bit about what I've learned here. And I'm going to read some quotes from some really good articles and stuff. So a lot of times people refer to proprioception as kind of like your sixth sense. And basically what it is your body awareness in space. It's your ability to sense where you're at. It's your ability to put your hand behind your head and then know, if you made a fist or if you made a flip off finger or something, you would know what's going on there without having to see it. Okay. You just know, you can feel where you're at. Or if you're walking into a dark room, you can kind of almost feel where you're at in the room because of what you understood about that room, but then your own body, where it's at, how to avoid certain things. Now, the classic proprioception miscue would be stubbing your toe in the middle of the night where you feel like you want to die. Like, oh my gosh. That's when you can say, F you, proprioception, So I'm going to read a couple quotes. So first one, if you break the word proprioception down, you get perception of self. Proprioception is intimately linked to one of the basic types of intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence. One could argue, that would be me in this instance, that kinesthetic intelligence is at the core of all other forms of intelligence, since it is with your physical body that you can experience any reality. And that quote was by a guy named Matt Booley. He's an osteopath, and he's often involved with Dr. John Russin's company and the pain-free performance certification that I've done. And he's written a couple articles for his website. Great perspectives. He actually dubs himself a posturologist. He's an osteopathic doctor, DO, but some super interesting research. I think he has a TED Talk online that you can watch. Matt Booley, spelled Boule. I'm going to quote him a couple more times here. Proprioception can also be entitled muscle sense. In order to know where you are in space without looking, your muscles are made up of receptors. These receptors are made up of muscle spindles. Muscle spindles are responsible for recording the length of a muscle. When a muscle is lengthened, when a muscle is shortened, it is sending less information to the central nervous system. In that context, we are less proprioceptive. He says, what a bummer that is. So it's about the sensitivity of the muscle spindle. The more sensitive the muscle spindle, the more you know where you are in space, and the more you can recruit the muscular system for certain activities. Again, that was Matt Boole. He's an osteopath. Just great quote. It just explains what proprioception actually is. And when you start to really understand it, you start to okay, how can we optimize it? And then we have to understand, okay, well, where does most of the proprioception in our bodies come from? It's mostly in and around the joints, because the joints are creating that feedback mechanism to our brains as to where we are in space. But if you had to guess where the most abundant proprioception is, where would you guess? Hint, I'm a chiropractor. It's the spine, okay? The spine has way more abundant proprioception than almost anything else, all the other distal joints, because it's your core, right? It's where you initiate movement from. There's this concept of needing proximal stability so you can have distal mobility. We'll talk more about that later, but your core has to know where it's at. So then it can coordinate how it's going to transmit force out into your limbs and not into your distal extremities and whatnot. So you can coordinate movement. So it's your core. Your core needs to coordinate movement. When we're upright and when we're, oriented with our world around us, well, the spine is heavily involved. And if you had to guess where the most abundant amount of proprioceptive neurology is, if you had to understand where your brain meets your spinal cord, that would make sense where a ton of proprioceptive neurology is, because it's really where your supercomputer is in space, and we need to constantly be regulating that. So the upper cervical area is where the most abundant proprioceptive mechanisms are, proprioceptive sensing mechanisms are. And that makes total sense because we want to make sure we know where our noggins are at all times. So proprioception and posture obviously have a connection here. Okay. And it seems to make total sense that you're not really going to understand where you're at if you don't understand how you're holding yourself to begin with, right? Like, it just makes sense. So I'm going to read a couple things here. I think these are back to Matt here. So it just so happens that a proprioceptive deficit is a postural imbalance. The two simply cannot be separated. Posture is movement, and movement is posture, and movement is proprioception. So now that we understand that posture is movement and it can't be separated from movement, we really can just solidify that posture, static posture specifically, doesn't really exist, because movement is just a succession of different postures. I've done a whole presentation on a certain way that your proprioception actually enhances your sixth sense, actually enhances your other five senses. It's in the article on my website. So if you go to drmatteikler.com, the article is called Your Busted Body, the relationship between pain, posture, proprioception, and performance. I got to print it out here because I was taking notes on it to do this podcast. But yeah, basically I'm going to try to summarize that in like 30 seconds. So we talked about proprioception, and proprioception being one of those things that helps us experience our day-to-day life, our physical life. And one of the main things that decreases proprioception is stiffness, is tightness, is a lack of mobility. Okay. Now, where does that usually come from? That usually comes from adaptation to lack of movement. It can come from scar tissue and fibrosis, from inflammation and injury. And most of the time, whenever you have inflammation, you're going to have fibrosis. So if you inflame an area, or if you have repetitive inflammation or that kind of thing, you're going to have fibrosis. Fibrosis is going to lead to stiffness most of the time if we're not handling it correctly. That stiffness is going to lead to proprioception loss, or a diminished proprioception. And then that's going to lead to a minimization of our ability to perceive our day-to-day environment through the other five senses, but also just through our ability to sense ourselves in space. I know this all is getting a little heady and crazy, but basically this presentation goes into how movement, exercise, chiropractic, and physical modalities, even addressing the hardware, improving the hardware, actually improves the proprioception, and the proprioception improves the software. It's just a brilliant mechanism, and it's helped connect a lot of dots in my head as far as what I'm actually doing as a chiropractor. And if I did nothing more than improve people's proprioception every time I adjusted them, I'm still doing them a huge favor. Maybe I'm not fixing their exact issue. Maybe I'm not taking a bone that's out of place and putting it back in place. I'm definitely not doing that. But I may be increasing their proprioception, their motor control, their ability to move a certain segment. That becomes an input into the supercomputer that is their system, that helps re-regulate and respond to what I did, hopefully with better movement mechanics or better efficiency with sensing their environment or their coordination and that kind of a thing. And when I look at manipulation and the way chiropractic adjustments affect people from that perspective, well, now that reboots my passion for doing it, because it is that important, because of just that mechanism, but it's doing a bunch of other stuff too. So trust me, I've heard all the shit talk about different chiropractors and all the things that people say about chiropractors, and I totally understand. I mean, a lot of us deserve it, you know, but I am doing my best to just try to be the best chiropractor I can be. However, I understand that being the best chiropractor isn't necessarily my goal either. I want to be the best practitioner to help people improve from a well-rounded perspective. I want to improve people's ability to move, and then via their ability to move, support that with all the other modalities that I know improve health, which is eating better, moving better is one of them, but thinking better and recuperating better and just doing those things that support health. Psst, it's Dr. Matt here. Hey, I want to let you in on a little secret. My free 83-page Chiro Companion Mobility Guide is now available at Elementx HFC, HFC as in healthandfitnesscoaching.com, elementxhfc.com. You just pop your email in there and then you can download it. All right, so what are you waiting for? Go grab it. And while you're feeling generous, why not give me a follow on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube? It's all at DRE Health. All right, no underscores, nothing, no periods, nothing. I promise to keep the health and fitness content coming. And who knows, you might even learn a thing or two. Last but not least, if you're enjoying the Health is Hard podcast, show us some love, rate it, review it, do that kind of thing that everybody asks you to do on the podcast. Any of those things would be super helpful. I appreciate you. Now go get your mobility on. Your ability to, when it comes to your ability to move, when you can move efficiently and effectively and sustainably and with strength and power, and you can resist gravity efficiently, your quality of life is way better than somebody else's that can't do those things. And I think that movement is actually the domino that affects all the other ones. And I think I explained in a previous podcast that I almost see myself as a practitioner, as a fitness facilitator. I'm trying to encourage people to move better, to move more, to move to a point where it improves their health. And if I have to passively influence that with my service or with my manipulation or with my modality, then that's doing people a huge favor. I guess that's the perfect segue to move into mobility and just moving better. And moving better requires we understand some fundamental concepts. And to tie all this together, we're going to talk about the 6 fundamental human movements and the joint by joint system, or regional interdependence is what is sometimes referred to in the academic community. So we have to kind of understand the relationship between mobility and stability, and then even flexibility as well. So let's talk about those things first before we understand what the joint by joint concept is. And we're only going to touch on it tonight. I might do a whole podcast on just the joint by joint protocol or perspective of looking at your entire body. So let's talk about flexibility, mobility, stability. So flexibility is basically, I'm going to read this, describes the ability of the individual joint complex or muscle tissue to move freely through its full range of motion with external help. This can be also kind of perceived as passive range of motion. So passive range of motion is, hey, you can move yourself a certain amount, but then if somebody helps you, what can your tissue do or joint do before it becomes injured, before we hit a hard stop, before we become limited by something, whether it's your own anatomy or a muscle tightness or something like that. So that's flexibility. Mobility, totally different. So a lot of people think flexibility and mobility are the same thing. Mobility, to me, and from what I've deduced from a lot of the research that I've done, describes the ability of an individual joint complex or muscle tissue to move freely through its range of motion without external help. So Anatomy 101 kind of teaches us that certain joints have a certain normal range of motion, and any kind of deviation from that norm would be considered a mobility deficit, I guess. But this would be your active range of motion. So this would be if you needed to use your range of motion in an abrupt situation, like let's say you step off a curb kind of weird and you kind of twist your ankle, or you have to reach for something really fast. What kind of mobility do you have accessible to you in any given moment? And that can be much different than your flexibility, because there's an interconnected mechanism here between mobility, stability, flexibility, all these things. And when certain adaptations occur, well, then we have limitations in certain deficits here. So basically mobility can be considered more your active range of motion, your active usable range of motion. And sometimes motor control gets involved. So, okay, I'm not going to get ahead of myself. That's mobility. Stability. Let's go on to stability. So, stability describes the ability of a joint complex or muscle tissue or whatever to maintain position, to not move without external help, without leaning into something or, allowing something else to help you not move while motion takes place somewhere else. So, it's the idea of having something anchored down and stable while movement's happening somewhere else. That's stability. Now, sometimes this is called motor control, but I think it's more appropriate to almost call it active control. So when you're actively doing a task or performing a certain movement, can you control this while you move this? Right. So let's take like your shoulder and scapula, for example. Super common thing is that your scapula is all funky, where your scapula should be kind of anchored down in a certain position at a certain time while your shoulder is able to move without your scapula moving. Okay. So it's a common thing to see the scapula doesn't have the necessary stability. The shoulder then therefore gets goofy with its mobility, and we have a weird situation happening that's usually going to cause a mechanical defect of some sort. Why is this all important? Okay. The reason why this is all important is because there's this super beautiful, intricate relationship between mobility and stability all the way throughout your body. And it's amazing actually how it works. I'm going to briefly just run through what happens here, but when we get this all garbled up, bad things happen. Okay, so your foot is meant to be pretty stable. There's a bunch of bones in your feet, and those bones have to coordinate stability so your ankle can be mobile. Your ankle tends to prefer to be pretty mobile. It wants to be able to move in different directions and then preserve the stability of the foot. So there's a relationship there. Now, if we don't have good mobility of the ankle, well, sometimes we'll get sloppy in the knee. Okay. So now the knee is meant to be pretty stable. It's a hinge joint. It has some rotation and torsion and that kind of thing, but it's meant to be pretty stable and only do one or two things at a time. Okay. It's not meant to be super crazy mobile. It wants to be stable. But what does want to be mobile is the hip. So you can see how we're just tracking up the body. The hip wants to be super, super mobile. It's a big ball and socket joint. It should be able to move all over the place and do all kinds of stuff. The hip's meant to be very mobile and prefers mobility, but the hip needs stability too. The hip's a unique one. Everything needs mobility and stability, but there's preferences for different joint complexes. And if we don't have one, which is the preference, usually things get goofed up. So the hip wants to be very mobile, and that allows the lumbopelvic spine just above to be very stable. The lumbopelvic spine has a lot of different joint complexes and articulations and whatnot, and can be very mobile, but it prefers to be pretty stable during movement. Okay. So the low back wants to be pretty stable. So the mid back is going to have to be pretty mobile, right? People's mid backs get super stiff. We see little hunched people all the time adapting to computer posture, tech neck, and all that stuff. Oh, I probably just triggered everybody. But most of the time, what happens is that the low back has to move more than it wants to, prefers to be pretty stable because the mid back and the hips are stiff. Okay. So the mid back wants to be mobile. If it's not, it creates chaos elsewhere. The scapula and how it articulates with the mid back is meant to be very stable. Okay. So if the mid back is mobile, well, now the scapula can be pretty stable. And the scapula being stable allows for the shoulder to be mobile. See how we're just tracking all the way up the body? Now, when the shoulder has good mobility, well, now the lower neck can be stable. The lower neck needs to be pretty stable so the upper neck can be pretty mobile. Okay. So it's like mobility, stability as far as preferences all the way throughout the body. It's a beautiful design. It's absolutely amazing. So when these things get goofed up, like let's take a low back example. I think I talked about this in the previous podcast. When the hips get super stiff due to sitting a lot, the average American sits 10 to 13 hours a day. When the hips get super tight and stiff and they can't move through their full range of motion, well, now we call on the lower back and the knee to move a whole bunch more so than they're designed to, or more so than they prefer to. And then usually that ends up with sloppy movement. And then that ends up with some sort of tissue insult because of the overburdening of a system that prioritizes a different thing. It's almost like an employee calls out of work and now a system has to do that employee's job. How much less efficient is that employee now because they have to do two jobs, right? So it's a perfect example to understand that when something prefers to be mobile and then it isn't, well, now the people around that area or the structures around that area have to pick up the pace, and they're not really designed to do those things. So they're overburdened, they're overworked, mistakes happen, issues happen, people get injured, and we got a mess on our hands, right? Each area of the body has to kind of pull its own weight as far as its preferences. And then we have optimal human movement. That optimal human movement has to be expressed through the 6 fundamental human movement patterns. Now, the 6 fundamental human movement patterns are the squat, the lunge, the hinge, and the push, the pull, and the carry. Those are the ways that humans move, and all activities of daily living are usually going to come back to those 6 movements. Let's just do a quick couple activities of daily living for each one. So squatting, moving boxes, sitting down on the toilet, getting in and out of a car, okay, that kind of a thing. Hinging, or actually let's go lunge first because I said lunge. So lunge, the lunge movement pattern is basically the gait cycle, walking, climbing stairs, hiking, jogging, holding a split stance for anything. The hinge movement is like the deadlift movement, the bending over to pick something up and then coming back up without destroying your spine and whatnot. So bending over to pick over anything up. I think about the way people look into their fridge. If you don't kind of adapt a somewhat of an athletic stance looking into the fridge, I've seen people injure themselves just scouring their fridge all the time. But things like gardening, landscaping, sweeping, those kind of things typically require we bend over. And if we don't know how to hinge, we bend in the wrong places and we end up beating certain tissues up over time. Okay, but upper body movement patterns. So the push would be like a push up or pushing anything away from us, or putting things away and store. I mean, obviously those are pretty obvious. Pulling anything, pulling something out of the back of a truck, pulling stuff from under your bed, moving furniture, moving boxes, those kind of things. You're gonna have to pull them into you. Those are the pulling patterns. And then the carry. So carry, everybody talks about hauling groceries in one trip, right? I'm not making 2 trips. I got to haul all these groceries in. So you're carrying things, but sometimes we're carrying more important things like children, or a heavy stimulus on one side of our body versus the other. We need to be able to stabilize and do that move. Those are the main 6 fundamental human movements. So when we understand how the joint by joint concept is expressed through those movements, and if we're training those movements effectively and efficiently, how we're actually expressing the joint by joint concept, it's this beautiful system. But understanding it really will help us move better and express mobility. And your mobility is just key to your physical life. It really is. When you can't move anymore, your health just dwindles if you can't move. So let's just recap, okay? Because we went over a bunch of stuff and I rambled a lot tonight. I'm sorry, but let's just recap a few things. And I'm gonna give you some tangible things to take away to really just help put a nice little bow on this, okay? So let's recap. There are no pain receptors. Pain's in your brain. And it's an interpretation of bothersome or harmful stimulus transmitted to your brain by the nociceptors. And that response can be influenced by many factors, a lot of different psychosocial factors, stress, physical, chemical, emotional stress can all be a factor there. And let's understand that noxious stimuli or tissue damage stimulates nociception, which in turn can reduce mechanoreception and proprioception, which we went off on a tirade about proprioception, understanding how important it is. Now, if nociception constantly is attacking or dwindling our mechanoreception and proprioception, you can see how this is a cascade of dysfunction that we need to address or understand. Pain can hang around in the neurology long after a injury or tissue insult has healed. Understanding both the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach for pain relief and for handling pain-related issues is critical, especially for chronic pain sufferers. Okay. On to posture. There is no static posture. We are living beings and we are always moving. Posture is just a phase of movement. So posture assessments can give us a lot of great clues as to what's happening when people are moving, because that's where a bulk of the injuries occur. But static posture itself doesn't really exist. It's just a phase of movement. And movement is a series of postures in succession. Okay. Proprioception is sort of a subconscious kinesthetic awareness of one's body in space. And many refer to it as like your 6th sense, and your 6th sense has the ability to enhance the other 5 senses. Maybe we'll do a whole podcast on that because it's super interesting stuff. Inflammation can lead to muscle and joint stiffness, which can lead to a decreased level of proprioception, which can have further reaching effects. That kind of ties into the other 5 senses like we talked about. But proprioception, posture, and movement are all so closely related that they can pretty much be considered synonyms. Proprioception, posture, and movement are pretty much all the same thing. And then understanding the joint by joint model and optimizing your anatomy for how it's designed can really help maximize proprioception, movement efficiency, and quality. It reduces, and that will reduce nociception and reduce injury risk and just optimize a ton of your physical life. Okay. But let's go with some tangible takeaways here. Okay. So, as far as dealing with pain, we got to stay motivated, we got to stay positive, and we have to utilize and understand graded exposure, and not just graded exposure, but just exposure to movement. We just got to exercise. We got to be moving. Okay. Super important. So don't take movement for granted. All right. There's so many people out there that can't move. There's people in wheelchairs. There's people that are missing limbs. There's people that can't move the way that they were designed to because of some horrific tragedy or whatnot. So if you can, don't take that for granted. Utilize it, use it or lose it. Just be super grateful that you can move. Okay. And that's the next one, is actually intrinsic gratitude for your ability to move. Be super grateful that you have all the physiological systems that allow you to move consistently. It's such a beautiful thing when you understand how detailed the anatomy is and how it all works together. Just being able to move is like this, almost like this gratitude practice. Okay. Or just moving your body, going to the gym doesn't become this drag. It almost becomes a gratitude practice where you're like, oh, I get to do this. I don't have to do this. Okay. And then maintain a growth mindset. Maintain the idea that you're always changing, that you're always in a place where you can improve, or you can get worse too. But you can always change. You're not fixed to a certain place. Okay. So that would be how to best deal with pain. And then we're going to go into a few more things here. Okay. We've got to move more. So here's how. Hopefully we've hammered home how important it is to move. A body in motion stays in motion. Human beings thrive when they're moving. I've probably hammered that enough now. So shoot for 8 to 10,000 steps a day. Definitely shoot for that. I mean, that's just critical. If you have to go out of your way to get your steps up, I think there's I think there's a huge amount of value in that. So walk more. Walking is underrated as far as just getting your tissues moving. It's not necessarily this super intense exercise, but movement is key. Movement transcends and includes exercise. I remember reading that in, I think it was one of Katie Bowman's books. Movement transcends and includes exercise. Maybe it was Joan Vernikos in her book, Sitting Kills, Moving Heals. I can't remember. Anyways, that's a cool way of thinking that. Movement transcends but includes exercise. So our daily physical life includes exercise, sure, but that shouldn't be the only opportunity to actually move our bodies. And it is Joan Vernikos, probably because she talks about G habits. So G habits are just, look for more opportunities to move. And you could take the stairs instead of the elevator, park further away from the grocery store, have to walk a little bit, take micro breaks during your long, stressful sitting hours, and just develop some sort of lifestyle practice that includes an active lifestyle, some sort of movement modality. I don't care if it's hiking or if it's rucking. And I have a patient that she just rucks. She's like part of a rucking club. And I'm like, cool. Yoga. I don't care if it's the crazy stuff, the all kinds of Zumba that you see, like, Zumba on like skates and stuff. Like, it's insane. I don't care. Just, we got to move. All right. And we're going to talk more about better ways to move. And I already talked last episode about muscle and how strength training is so important, but not really going into that much tonight because I've hammered it in the first few episodes. So we got to move, but we also have to move better. And how do we move better? Well, we need to consistently be doing some sort of body maintenance. We need to be consistently taking inventory of what's tight, what's stiff, where our deficiencies are, and trying to improve them. I would say a minimum of 3 times a week, we have some sort of body maintenance or stretching routine or something that we're doing for 20 minutes or so to maximize the efficiency of how we're moving. Once we understand how important that is, we usually are more motivated to do it. And with your mobility efforts, if you're going to stretch, if you're going to do some sort of mobility work, if you're going to foam roll, focus on the areas that prefer mobility in your body. Okay. And just to recap, those were your ankles. So ankles, calves, those kind of things, stretching those out. Your hips. Oh my gosh. Hip stiffness is like an epidemic. Okay. Hip stiffness is probably the more common thing I see contributing to lower back pain than almost anything else. Almost anything else. Okay. I don't care if you have 3 or 4 blown discs in your lower back and they're all just shredded to it looks like a junkyard in your lower back. If your hips are stiff, I'm going to attack that. I'm going to see if we can take the burden off your lower back by giving you some ability to move through your hips. Okay. So the hips are the other one. So remember, foot stability, ankle mobility, knee stability, hips mobility. All right. Next one, low back stability. We need to be able to stay pretty stable in the low back, the lumbopelvic spine, but then your thoracic spine has to be mobile. That's another, between the hips and the thoracic spine. If people were just addressing those, we'd be in much better shape. Okay. The thoracic spine is always stiff on people. What's the number one thing chiropractors usually do? Like when they put you on the table and they go crunch right into your mid back, everybody's mid back needs mobility, like almost everybody across the board. It's probably pretty rare when you go to your chiropractor and he doesn't adjust something in your, or mobilize or manipulate or whatever, something in your mid thoracic spine. Scapulothoracic joint needs to be stable. So let's focus our efforts on shoulder mobility as well. I'm going to recap these for you here in a second. And then lower neck needs to be stable. So let's focus our efforts or mobility in the neck in the upper cervical spine. So just to recap those, let's go back through. Focus your mobility efforts on your ankles, your hips, your thoracic spine, your shoulders, and your upper cervical spine. Okay. That will be way more efficient with your mobility efforts, and you'll be able to shortcut a bunch of stuff where you're not thumping away on trying to make something mobile that usually prefers to be stable. And then we got to maintain strength and the ability to move through the 6 fundamental human movements. Again, that was the squat, hinge, lunge, and the push, pull, carry. We need to be able to do those. We need to progressively build strength, or at least maintain our ability to do those with a certain amount of capacity or capability. Super important. Okay. So strength training, those fundamental patterns should be how you design your strength training programs. You should have a squat day, a hinge day, a lunge day. Maybe combine your squat and your lunge day and do a hinge day. So let's say a squat lunge day, a hinge day, and then let's do a push pull day, maybe a whole separate pull day, because I prefer you do more pulling than pushing. And then you got to throw some carries in there too. Carries are really your best way to train your core. So in my opinion, carries are static kind of anti-motion exercises with your core. More to come on all that. Okay. So there's some solid takeaways you can take into your daily life, and you will improve dramatically if you just do those things. So, obviously these are the things I focus on with my coaching clients. There's so much to think about, and there's so much analysis. Even if I just am assessing somebody's range of motion, I'm thinking of like 3 or 4 different situations. So, I'm always trying to stick to 3 main concepts: effectiveness, efficiency, sustainability. That is the key. All right. So, if you're looking for any kind of movement, mobility, physical training, coaching, that kind of thing, that's what we do at Element X. So there might be an ad in here somewhere that's already ran to show you some things. I also have a mobility guide on my website that goes through my IRSIT system, the IRSIT system, which is the way to basically create lasting mobility. But I've just revolutionized it, and I'm rebuilding and I'm rewriting that book right now because I've changed it to the Pulse system. So there's more to come on that, and keep an eye out for that coming up soon. And that will all be accessible probably through my website, elementxhfc.com, health and fitness coaching, Element X health and fitness coaching. So hfc.com. I appreciate you tuning in. I hope you got something from this. I'm sorry if it was all over the place a little bit, because there's just a lot to cover, and it all comes together when it comes to pain, posture, and mobility. So I'm going to leave you with a quote, and I love this one. I don't think he was necessarily talking about things in the context that I am thinking of them now, or that you are probably now after listening to this. However, let's just read it. So, if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving. And that was Martin Luther King. Again, I don't think he was talking about what I'm talking about. However, it applies perfectly. Appreciate you. Thanks for tuning in. All right, that's a wrap for today's episode of the Health is Hard podcast. I hope you found some valuable tips to help you on your journey to a healthier, more fit, more resilient version of you.
Remember, building a stronger, healthier you takes time, and I'm here to support you every step of the way. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend who could benefit from the goods that were in this one. Be sure to check out the show notes for resources and a special offer from our sponsor, Element X Health and Fitness. As a listener, you can get my free 83-page Chiro Companion Mobility Guide when you visit elementxhfc.com. That's Element X, H as in health, F as in fitness, C as in culture. If you have questions, suggestions, or just want to connect, find me, Dr. Matt, on Instagram and TikTok at Dr. E Health, DRE Health, and Twitter at DREX Health. Let's keep this conversation going. Thank you for being part of the health and fitness culture we're building together. Keep putting in the work, stay consistent, and cheers to making health a little less hard today.